Something strange was happening in Cleveland, and most fans didn't notice it until it was already too late. A young quarterback arrives to a team desperate for answers. The offense is clearly struggling, and yet he barely touches the field. No real reps, no real chance. And according to one former NFL player, that wasn't an accident. Recently, Houshmandzade ignited a firestorm with comments that sent shockwaves across the league. He didn't just criticize play calling or development. He suggested something far more uncomfortable, that Kevin Stefanski never truly wanted Shedeur Sanders to succeed in the first place. And if that sounds extreme, TJ made it clear this was based on what he claims to have seen and heard, not random guessing. What makes this so explosive is the timing. The Cleveland Browns were searching for stability at the most important position in football, yet one option seemed permanently stuck on the sidelines. No matter how messy things looked, no matter how desperate the situation became, the door never fully opened. That's where fans began asking the same question TJ did. Why? Now, to be clear, these are allegations and interpretations, not official findings. But once those words were spoken publicly, they forced everyone to re-examine what really happened behind closed doors. Because if even part of this is true, it changes the entire story. Not just about one player, but about power, control, and how quietly careers can be redirected in the NFL. And once you hear what TJ claims happened next, the situation looks even darker. Write next section, and make it around 350 words. Here's the next section, written to expand the tension, introduce new information, and keep everything cleanly framed as opinion and observation, not fact. Around 400 words, fast-paced and non-repetitive. What made this situation stand out wasn't just that a quarterback wasn't playing. That happens all the time in the NFL. It was how it happened. Teams usually make their intentions clear. A player is either being developed, protected, or phased out. In this case, according to those speaking out, none of that clarity existed. Instead, there was silence, deflection, and a pattern that didn't line up with normal football logic. Reports and commentary suggest the quarterback room was unstable. The offense lacked rhythm. Adjustments weren't sticking. In moments like that, coaches typically explore every possible option, even briefly, just to spark momentum. That's standard practice across the league. But insiders and analysts watching closely claim that opportunity never truly arrived here. Not in meaningful reps, not in moments that mattered. And that's where eyebrows started going up. What fueled the speculation even more was how the situation was handled publicly. Questions came up, direct ones, and yet answers never seemed to match what fans were seeing on Sundays. Explanations leaned on vague language, development, timing, fit, without ever showing clear steps toward change. Over time, that gap between words and actions created a perception that something else was at play. Former players chimed in, not accusing but questioning. They pointed out how rare it is to see a young quarterback kept this far from the conversation when a team is visibly searching for solutions. Some suggested it felt less like a football decision and more like a closed door that was never going to open. Again, these were opinions, but they were coming from people who have lived inside NFL locker rooms and understand how these dynamics usually work. And then there was the emotional side of it. When a player doesn't know where he stands, confidence erodes quietly. Practices feel different. Preparation feels uncertain. Even small things, body language, meeting room energy, can shift. Analysts noted that when support isn't obvious, development stalls long before stats ever reflect it. None of this proves intent. None of it confirms motive. But taken together, the pattern raised serious questions. Because if this truly was just about patience or protection, the process would have looked very different. And as the season moved forward, those unanswered questions didn't fade, they multiplied. At some point, the conversation shifted. What began as questions about development slowly turned into speculation about motive. Not because of one decision, but because of a pattern that kept repeating. According to analysts and former players watching from the outside, the situation no longer looked like a coach being cautious. It looked like a player being excluded. One of the biggest red flags people pointed to was how rarely the quarterback was even mentioned. In press conferences, answers danced around direct questions. Names were avoided. Opportunities were discussed in theory but never followed by visible action. That kind of silence is unusual in the NFL, especially when the position in question is quarterback. Coaches normally overcommunicate there. Here, the communication felt absent. This is where Houshmandzade pushed the conversation further. Based on his experience, he suggested that when a coach believes in a player, even privately, it shows. Extra reps appear, packages get built, the player stays involved in the plan, and when none of that happens, it sends a message, whether intentional or not. He didn't present documents or internal memos, but he framed his comments around patterns he claims are impossible to miss if you've been in NFL buildings long enough. Another factor that added fuel was perceived favoritism. Observers noted other quarterbacks receiving chances that didn't seem earned through performance alone. Again, no official confirmation, no leaked reports, just repeated observations from people who know how depth charts usually function. To some, it felt like the door was cracked open for everyone except one person. The psychological impact of that kind of environment can't be ignored. When a player senses he's not truly being considered, preparation changes, confidence dips, risk-taking disappears. Development doesn't just slow, it freezes. Several analysts emphasize that this doesn't require open hostility. Sometimes all it takes is indifference. Still, it's important to say this clearly. None of this proves personal dislike as fact. These are interpretations, shaped by experience and hindsight. But in professional sports, perception matters almost as much as reality. And once the idea of bias takes hold, it reshapes how every decision is viewed. By the time the season wore on, many fans weren't just asking why he wasn't playing. They were asking whether he ever truly had a chance at all. And that question became impossible to ignore once everything came crashing down. Long before any coaching changes became official, the damage was already done. Not on the stat sheet, not in headlines, but in the quiet spaces where young quarterbacks are supposed to grow. Multiple analysts have pointed out that development in the NFL isn't just about snaps on Sunday. It's about trust during the week. And according to commentary surrounding this situation, that trust never fully formed. When a quarterback doesn't know where he stands, everything becomes uncertain. Practice reps feel conditional. Feedback feels incomplete. Even progress can feel invisible. Former players have explained that when a coaching staff truly believes in someone, they make that belief obvious. Meetings are more detailed. Adjustments are collaborative. The player feels included in the future. But here, the outside perception was the opposite. The quarterback appeared stuck in limbo, not starting, not clearly developing, and not visibly moving forward. That uncertainty can be more damaging than failure. Failure at least offers clarity. You know what went wrong. You know what to fix. But when opportunities never come, the question becomes more unsettling. Was I ever really being evaluated? Analysts have suggested that this kind of environment quietly chips away at confidence, especially for young players trying to establish themselves at the highest level. What made the situation even more uncomfortable was how little changed as the season progressed. Struggles continued elsewhere. Adjustments were attempted, and yet the same decisions remained. To some observers, it felt like the outcome was predetermined, not because of performance, but because the internal verdict had already been reached. Again, none of this confirms intent. There's no official report stating that development was intentionally blocked, but former players emphasize something important. In the NFL, intent often doesn't matter as much as effect. If a player's growth stalls, if confidence erodes, if opportunities disappear, the result is the same regardless of the reason. By the time the coaching change became reality, many fans and analysts began looking backward instead of forward. Suddenly, earlier moments felt different. Comments sounded heavier. Silence felt louder. Decisions that once seemed minor were reinterpreted as warning signs. And that's when the conversation expanded beyond one coach and one quarterback. It became a broader discussion about how power works inside professional sports, how quietly decisions can shape careers, and how rarely those decisions are ever fully explained. What happened next didn't bring immediate answers, but it did something else. It opened the door for people who had been holding their tongues to finally speak. Coaching changes have a way of flipping the story overnight. Decisions that once felt ordinary suddenly get re-examined. Silence becomes suspicious, and moments that barely registered during the season start carrying much heavier weight. That's exactly what happened once the Browns moved on from Kevin Stefanski. Almost immediately, the conversation shifted from what went wrong to what was really going on. In the NFL, firings don't just end chapters, they unlock them. Players talk more freely. Analysts revisit old footage. Former insiders feel less pressure to stay quiet. And that's when commentary from people like Houshmandzade started gaining serious traction. His remarks didn't feel random anymore. They felt timed. Not because they were planned, but because the environment had finally changed enough for people to listen. What stood out most was how predictable the fallout felt to some observers. TJ and others had been raising concerns earlier, when it was far less popular to do so. At the time, those comments were brushed off as overreactions or media noise. But once the coaching change became official, those same critiques suddenly sounded less like hot takes and more like warnings that went ignored. This is where hindsight becomes dangerous and powerful. Fans began replaying press conferences, rewatching games, and reinterpreting decisions that once seemed insignificant. Why was that opportunity skipped? Why did the messaging never change? Why did certain explanations repeat without visible results? None of these questions prove wrongdoing, but together, they reshaped how the entire season was remembered. Importantly, this doesn't mean the firing confirms every allegation. NFL teams part ways with coaches for countless reasons: performance, philosophy, direction. There has been no official statement tying the coaching change directly to quarterback development or internal conflict. But perception doesn't wait for confirmation. Once a narrative takes hold, it fills the gaps that transparency leaves behind. And for Cleveland Browns, that perception became part of the challenge moving forward. The organization wasn't just resetting a playbook. It was inheriting questions it didn't ask, doubts it didn't create, and a fan base now looking at the past through a much sharper lens. The coaching change didn't deliver answers. It delivered permission for speculation, for reevaluation, and for a story that no longer felt finished. And that left one final figure at the center of it all, facing a future still very much undecided. As the story spread, the NFL world didn't land on one clear conclusion. Instead, it split sharply. On one side were those who felt the criticism was overdue. Former players, analysts, and fans argued that what happened fit a familiar pattern they'd seen before. Young quarterbacks quietly sidelined, development stalled, and explanations that never quite matched reality. To them, the comments from Houshmandzade weren't reckless. They were honest. Supporters of that view pointed to experience. They argued that players who have lived through locker room politics can recognize the signs early: the subtle distancing, the lack of investment, the unspoken decisions already made. From this angle, TJ wasn't accusing anyone of wrongdoing. He was describing what he believes happens when belief is absent, and how that absence can quietly end a player's momentum before it ever truly begins. But the other side pushed back just as hard. Critics called the narrative unfair and overly speculative. They argued that coaching decisions are complex, layered, and often misunderstood from the outside. Development isn't linear. Playing time isn't owed. And not every stalled opportunity points to bias or personal issues. From their perspective, this was a classic case of hindsight shaping a story that felt cleaner than reality ever is. Some also questioned timing. Why did this conversation explode after the coaching change? Why didn't it gain traction when decisions were being made in real time? To skeptics, that mattered. They warned against letting frustration and disappointment retroactively rewrite intent, especially without internal confirmation. Caught in the middle was the organization itself. The Cleveland Browns never publicly validated either side. No statements, no clarifications, just forward movement. And that silence did what silence often does. It allowed debate to grow louder. Fans filled the gaps with interpretation. Media segments leaned into contrast, and the story took on a life beyond football decisions alone. What made this divide so intense was that both sides believed they were protecting the integrity of the game. One side focused on accountability and opportunity. The other focused on fairness and process. Neither could definitively prove their case, and that uncertainty kept the debate alive. Because in the NFL, truth is rarely revealed all at once. It leaks out through opinions, patterns, and moments that only make sense later. And until something concrete emerges, this story remains suspended between two realities, one where a player was wronged, and another where hard decisions were simply misunderstood. And that unresolved tension set the stage for the most important question of all: what happens now? When the noise finally dies down, what's left is the player. And for Shedeur Sanders, the future now sits at a strange crossroads, shaped as much by perception as by performance. In the NFL, narratives stick. Fair or not, they follow players into meeting rooms, draft boards, and contract talks. And this one has already taken on a life of its own. Some believe this moment could quietly reset everything. A new coaching voice, a fresh evaluation, a clean slate where past assumptions no longer carry weight. Around the league, quarterbacks have rebuilt careers in less forgiving circumstances than this. A change in environment can do what talent alone sometimes can't: unlock confidence, clarity, and momentum. For supporters, that's the optimistic path forward. Others are more cautious. They point out that time lost is rarely returned. Development windows in professional football are brutally short, especially at quarterback. Missed reps don't just disappear. Confidence, once shaken, has to be rebuilt intentionally. And while new leadership can change opportunity, it can't erase questions already circulating in scouting circles. Whether those questions are fair is almost beside the point. What matters is that they exist. What complicates things further is that this situation didn't unfold loudly. There was no public meltdown, no dramatic benching moment, no viral sideline blow-up. It happened quietly, which makes it harder to explain and easier to misinterpret. That ambiguity cuts both ways. It leaves room for reinvention, but it also leaves room for doubt. The key now is alignment. Quarterbacks don't just need skill, they need belief from the people designing the offense, calling the plays, and shaping the weekly plan. Without that alignment, talent stalls. With it, progress can happen fast. League insiders often say the difference between a bust and a breakout is sometimes just one coach willing to commit. For the Cleveland Browns, this next phase is just as important. How they handle communication, development, and opportunity moving forward will signal whether lessons were learned or merely survived. Fans will be watching, so will the rest of the league. Because this story was never just about what didn't happen. It's about what still can, and whether the next chapter finally allows a quarterback to be evaluated on football alone, not whispers, not silence, and not the shadows of decisions already made. What makes this story linger isn't outrage or blame, it's uncertainty. No leaked report, no internal memo, no definitive statement explaining exactly why things unfolded the way they did. Just fragments, opinions, patterns people believe they recognize too late. And in a league as powerful and insulated as the NFL, that gray area is often where the real stories live. For the Cleveland Browns, this moment isn't just about moving on from one coach or reevaluating one quarterback. It's about trust. Trust from players who need to believe opportunity is real. Trust from fans who want transparency, even when answers are uncomfortable. And trust from the league, where reputations are built quietly and undone even faster. What's unsettling is how easily this could happen again, not just here, but anywhere. A player arrives with expectations. Decisions are made behind closed doors. Public explanations sound reasonable. And by the time questions feel justified, the season is already over. Careers don't always end with failure. Sometimes they fade in silence. That's why reactions to this situation have been so intense. Some see it as a warning about unchecked power. Others see it as a reminder that football decisions are rarely simple. Both can be true at the same time. The NFL thrives on certainty, wins, losses, depth charts. But behind that structure is a human system, shaped by belief, bias, patience, and pressure. As for the quarterback at the center of it all, the story isn't finished. It may never be fully explained either. And that's the uncomfortable part. Fans want clarity. Players want fairness. But the league often moves forward without providing either. What remains are debates like this one, unresolved, emotionally charged, and impossible to ignore. Maybe years from now, someone speaks more openly. Maybe nothing new ever comes out. Either way, this situation has already done something important. It's forced people to ask better questions about development, about opportunity, about how much of a player's fate is decided before the helmet ever goes on. And that's the part that should stick with you. Not who was right, not who was wrong, but how many stories like this exist quietly shaping careers without anyone ever really knowing the full truth.